My parents gave my entire 8 million inheritance to my stepbrother and acted like I didn't exist at all. They cut me out completely, erased me from the family. But what they didn't know was I wasn't about to let this slide. Behind their backs, I had a secret that would change everything. What I did next, no one could have seen it coming. My name is Jessica, and I'm 29 years old. I live and work in New York City, where I've built my career as a young, ambitious lawyer. Growing up, my life wasn't as straightforward as many people's. I was my mother's only child, and my father remarried when I was still a kid. My stepmother came into the picture with her own son, my stepbrother. Our family dynamic was complicated from the start, and I always felt like an outsider in my own home. My mother, Susan, was a strong, loving woman who raised me on her own after her divorce from my dad, Robert. She worked hard to provide for me, juggling 2 jobs to make sure I had every opportunity. Because of that, I developed a fierce independence and determination from a young age. I was always the kind of kid who set her sights high. Good grades, scholarships, internships, everything to get me into the best law schools. And I made it happen. My father's remarriage changed everything. Robert married a woman named Linda when I was about 12 years old. Linda had a son, Eric, who was just a couple of years older than me. From the beginning, the relationship between me and Eric was distant, not hostile, but strained. We never really clicked. Linda seemed to favor her own son, and it was clear she wanted Eric to inherit the family legacy, whatever that meant. We lived in a sprawling house on the Upper East Side, an area of Manhattan known for wealth and influence. But despite the luxury around me, I always felt like I was fighting for a place in my own family. My father was often distant, caught up in his business, and my stepmother's cold attitude made it clear I was never truly accepted. I threw myself into my studies and my work, partly to escape the tension at home. After college, I attended a top law school, then landed a job at a prestigious law firm in Manhattan. I was proud of what I accomplished on my own. It felt like my way of proving I was worthy, no matter what my family thought. Over the years, my visits to my father's house became fewer and farther between. The family gatherings were awkward, filled with thin smiles and unspoken resentment. Yet I never expected what happened next to shake the foundation of my life entirely. When my parents passed away within months of each other, the shock was devastating. Despite everything, I had hoped that maybe the family drama would finally end. But instead, it only grew worse. The reading of the will was the worst day of my life. I sat in a cold, sterile office surrounded by lawyers and distant relatives waiting to hear my name. Instead, I heard Eric's. Every dollar, every asset, all $8 million was left to my stepbrother. And me, I was left with nothing. Not a single word, not even a mention. It felt like a slap in the face, a final erasure. My parents had completely cut me out. The family I thought I had was gone. Since that day, the lines of communication have been severed. My stepmother and Eric stopped returning my calls and messages. They pretended I didn't exist, as if I was some inconvenient ghost. The house that once held memories became a fortress I was no longer allowed to enter. But beneath the heartbreak and betrayal, something inside me ignited. I knew I couldn't accept this injustice quietly. I wasn't just going to disappear. I was determined to fight back no matter what it took. And so with my law degree and a burning sense of purpose, I began to dig deeper into what had really happened with that will and what secrets my family was desperate to keep hidden. After the reading of the will, everything changed. I remember sitting there stunned, unable to believe what I was hearing. My stepbrother Eric was the sole beneficiary of my parents' $8 million inheritance. Not a single dollar was left for me, their own daughter. It was as if I never existed. The feeling of shock quickly turned to disbelief, then to deep pain. How could my parents do this? I was their child, the one they raised, supported through law school, the one who had fought to build her own life. Yet all their wealth went to a boy who barely acknowledged me. The official explanation from the family lawyer was vague. They claimed it was my father's final decision and that the will was legally sound. But that didn't explain the sudden coldness, the way my calls and messages were ignored afterward. It was like I'd been erased from the family story entirely. Worse still, my stepmother Linda took the lead in shutting me out. She refused to answer my questions and avoided any contact. Friends who still kept in touch with me told me that Linda had been quietly telling everyone that I was ungrateful and not worthy of any inheritance. My stepbrother Eric never reached out or showed any remorse. To him, I was just a name from the past. Weeks passed in a blur of confusion and heartbreak. I was left with no money, no home, and no family support. I had my job, yes, but the emotional blow was crushing. More than the loss of money, it was the loss of trust and love from the people who were supposed to care for me the most. One day, out of the blue, I received an email from Linda. It was cold, almost mocking. She wrote, "You're not entitled to a single cent, Jessica. You never were. Our family legacy is for those who deserve it." The words cut deeper than I expected. This wasn't just a matter of money. It was a declaration that I was unwanted, that my entire existence was a mistake. That email was the breaking point. I couldn't just sit back and accept this humiliation. But where could I turn? I had always believed in justice. After all, I was a lawyer now. Maybe the law could give me the answers and the justice I deserved. I began to examine the will more closely, looking for any legal loopholes, any evidence of manipulation or coercion. The more I dug, the more I found oddities. Certain clauses were vague and confusing, and some signatures didn't seem quite right. It felt like someone had tampered with the documents to exclude me intentionally. But challenging a will is never easy, especially when the opposing side is wealthy and well-connected. I knew I was up against a powerful family machine determined to keep me silent. Still, I wasn't going to back down. I started building my case, gathering evidence, and consulting with trusted legal experts. I also reached out to a few journalists, hoping that public exposure could help level the playing field. The fight was just beginning, but one thing was clear: I wasn't invisible anymore. I was ready to confront the lies, the betrayal, and the family secrets that had kept me in the shadows for too long. And no matter what it took, I was determined to reclaim what was rightfully mine, not just for the money, but for my dignity and my truth. The silence in my apartment was suffocating. After reading that email from Linda, I sat alone on my couch, the blue light of my laptop casting long shadows on the walls. Every word she wrote played in my head on a loop, each sentence more poisonous than the last. "You never were part of this family. You don't belong here." The betrayal wasn't just legal, it was personal. and it struck a nerve I hadn't realized was still exposed. I tried to sleep that night, but my thoughts clawed at me like ghosts. Memories I'd buried began to resurface. Birthdays, forgotten holidays where I was treated like a guest, the quiet looks between Linda and Eric when I walked into the room. It was as if my entire childhood had been a performance I never got to finish, a script written for someone else. The next morning, I woke up with dark circles under my eyes and a knot in my chest. I forced myself out of bed and into my office, but I couldn't focus. Legal documents blurred before me and phone calls felt hollow. My mind was elsewhere, buried in betrayal. 3 days later, I received another email, this time from the estate attorney. It was curt and final. Per the expressed wishes of the deceased, you are not entitled to any portion of the estate. Please do not contact us again. That was it. No explanation. No opportunity to ask questions. Just a digital door slammed shut. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was humiliated. That night, I sat on my bathroom floor and cried until my throat burned. How could people I once loved go to such lengths to erase me? I had done everything right. I had sacrificed. I had excelled. I had even tried to be civil when they didn't deserve it. And yet here I was, discarded. The following week, I attended a dinner hosted by a former mentor from law school. I put on a brave face, smiled through the small talk, and tried to pretend that nothing was wrong. But when she pulled me aside and asked if I was okay, something in me broke. I told her everything. Not just about the inheritance, but the years of being the outsider. The feeling that no matter what I did, I would never be enough. She listened quietly, then said something that would change everything. Jessica, what happened to you wasn't just cruel. It might be illegal. That night, I went home and poured myself into the law. I read case after case, digging into every clause, every precedent related to estate fraud, undue influence, and disinheritance. My heart beat faster as I realized how much of my family's will didn't make sense. The phrasing was inconsistent. Witnesses listed had clear connections to Linda's side of the family, and some of the signatures, they didn't match the records I had. I reached out to a forensic document examiner. I paid out of pocket to have the signatures reviewed, even if it meant maxing out my credit card. Days later, the report came back. Significant inconsistencies detected possible forgery. My stomach turned. Could it really be that they had forged my father's signature? Fueled by disbelief, I drove to the town where my father had owned property. I spoke to neighbors, former employees, even the doorman of his building. One of them, an elderly woman who had worked as his housekeeper for years, told me something that chilled me to the bone. He used to talk about you all the time, Jessica. Said you were the pride of his life, but he cut me out of the will, I whispered. She shook her head. That doesn't sound like the man I knew. That night, I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot and wept. I hadn't cried like that in years, not from frustration, but from grief. It was one thing to be disinherited. It was another to learn that my father may have died thinking I'd still be taken care of, only for someone to erase me on purpose. I began building a timeline, date signatures, phone calls, witness statements. I compared emails. I dug up old voicemails. I even pulled phone records to track my father's calls during the final months of his life. I discovered he'd called my number 3 times the week before he died. I never received those calls. My number had changed, But why hadn't he emailed? Or had someone deleted those messages? I began to suspect that Linda had isolated him during his illness. Medical records, when I finally accessed them through a subpoena, confirmed that he had been diagnosed with mild cognitive decline, not enough to render him fully incapacitated, but enough that any sudden changes to legal documents would be suspicious. One morning, I stood outside the county courthouse with a thick folder in my arms. It contained every piece of evidence I had gathered: forged signatures, inconsistent witness statements, altered legal documents. My hands trembled as I filed the motion to contest the will. Word spread fast. Eric called me within days. It was the first time I'd heard his voice in months. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked. "Getting back what's mine," I replied. "You're going to regret this," he sneered. "Not as much as you will," I said before hanging up. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry, and anger in my case was clarifying. The court set a date for the initial hearing. I began prepping my case like it was the most important trial of my life, because it was. I reviewed every document, practiced every argument, and braced myself for the inevitable personal attacks. I knew Linda and Eric would try to make me look ungrateful, greedy, or bitter, but I had the truth. In the days leading up to the hearing, I started receiving anonymous emails. Some were threatening. Others were just disturbing. One simply said, "Drop it, or we'll make sure you disappear for good." I reported everything to the authorities. A detective took my case seriously, especially after I showed him the forged documents. He opened an investigation into possible elder abuse and fraud. That added weight to my court motion and fear in the eyes of Linda and Eric. But despite the mounting evidence, I still doubted myself. What if the judge didn't care? What if I'd spent months fighting for something I'd never win? One night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and stared into my own reflection. "You deserve better," I whispered. "You are not what they said you were." The hearing finally arrived. I wore a navy blue suit and held my head high as I walked into the courtroom. Linda sat across from me, her expression smug but brittle. Eric avoided eye contact. Their lawyer tried to dismiss me as emotionally unstable and estranged, but I countered every argument with cold, hard facts. I played a voicemail from my father that I'd recovered from an old backup. "Hey, Jess, I'm trying to reach you. I want to talk about updating the will." The courtroom went still. Then I showed the expert analysis on the signatures, the side-by-side comparison of my father's known handwriting versus what was on the last will. "These are not the same," the examiner testified. "This is likely a forgery." Linda's face went pale. I looked at the judge, my voice steady. "This isn't just about money. It's about being erased. It's about justice. And it's about a man who trusted the wrong people when he was at his most vulnerable." The judge ordered a full probate investigation and temporarily froze all estate distributions. As I left the courtroom that day, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, but I was finally being heard. The painful climax wasn't just about legal betrayal. It was the emotional reckoning of a daughter who had spent her whole life fighting for a family that never fought for her. But I wasn't fighting for their love anymore. I was fighting for the truth, and I wouldn't stop until I had it all. The email from my stepfather wasn't just cruel. It was a declaration of war. He had written, "You were always an outsider. Your mother married up, and you just coasted on our name. You're not entitled to anything, Jessica. Move on with your sad life. I stared at that line for hours, letting the fire build. It wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about dignity. It was about justice. And most of all, it was about truth. I'd spent years studying corporate law, digging through contracts, and navigating power struggles in boardrooms. I never imagined I'd have to turn those skills against my own family. But here we were. Step 1, challenge the will. I started by hiring my firm's most aggressive probate litigation specialist, Nora Hale. She was older, sharp as a scalpel, and absolutely ruthless in court. When I showed her the will and how I had been completely excluded, while my stepbrother Brian received everything, she raised an eyebrow. "Was your father under any sort of care when this will was signed?" she asked. "Yeah, he had early signs of dementia," I said. "He wasn't making coherent decisions near the end." She smiled. "Good. That's where we start." We filed an official petition to contest the will, citing lack of capacity and undue influence. I also submitted a request for a temporary injunction to freeze the transfer of assets. The court granted the freeze within 2 weeks. Brian, of course, went ballistic. He called me a vulture in a text message. I didn't respond. I just forwarded it to Nora and added it to our growing pile of evidence. Step 2, build the public pressure. I didn't stop at the legal route. I also knew how much Brian and my stepfather cared about image. Brian had just been appointed to the board of a charitable foundation my father had funded, and my stepfather sat on the board of a local museum. So I went to the press. Anonymously, at first I contacted an investigative journalist I knew from law school. I gave him documents, old emails, and videos that showed my father's health deteriorating while Linda, my stepmother, was forcing him to sign paperwork he didn't understand. Soon, an article dropped billionaire's final days in question. Was this fortune stolen? The fallout was immediate. The museum suspended my stepfather. The foundation issued a statement reviewing the situation. Suddenly, people were calling me. Former employees, a former driver, even a housekeeper who had worked for us 10 years ago. They all had stories. Linda had isolated my father. Brian had moved into his home 2 months before the will was changed. No one had seen me at the funeral because they hadn't even sent me the date. Step 3, expose their pattern. What Nora and I uncovered next made my stomach turn. This wasn't the first time Linda had done something like this. Her first husband's children had also been cut out of their inheritance. And Brian, he had been sued twice in the past by ex-business partners for financial misconduct cases that were settled quietly. We compiled a dossier, timelines, affidavits, depositions, financial records. It was damning. I remember Nora sitting back in her chair and saying, "Jessica, we have enough to win. But more than that, we have enough to destroy them." And I smiled. Step 4, confront them publicly. At the next court hearing, I made sure I was there in person. I hadn't seen Brian or Linda face to face since the funeral. They walked in with their expensive lawyers, acting like this was all a nuisance. Brian even winked at me. But then Nora started laying out the timeline. Then came the video of my father, confused in his wheelchair, asking where I was. Then the letter from his doctor warning the family that he was mentally impaired and shouldn't be signing any legal documents. Then came the deposition from the nurse. She told me not to let anyone visit, the nurse said, especially Jessica. She said Jessica would confuse him. But when I asked your father if he wanted to see his daughter, he cried. I didn't cry in that courtroom, but I saw Linda's lawyer shift uncomfortably, and I saw Brian's smirk fall away. Step 5. Turn karma into purpose. The court battle stretched for months. During that time, I started a blog under a pseudonym where I shared stories, disguised, anonymized, of families torn apart by greed. The stories went viral. People messaged me thanking me for voicing what they were too ashamed to admit. One woman wrote, I thought I was the only one whose stepfamily erased her. Thank you for fighting. That message lit something in me. When the judge finally ruled in our favor, it wasn't just validation, it was liberation. The will was overturned. The estate was to be divided equally between me and Brian, but because of the financial misconduct uncovered in our investigation, Brian's share was frozen, pending further investigation. He and Linda were later charged with tax fraud thanks to evidence our team handed over to federal prosecutors. They had been hiding assets overseas. I didn't just get my half of the $8 million. I got it with a clean name and with the knowledge that justice had been done. But I didn't stop there. I used part of the inheritance to start a nonprofit called True Kin, dedicated to supporting individuals betrayed by their own families through legal aid, mental health services, and storytelling platforms. Our first clients were women who had been disinherited, isolated, or manipulated by wealthy step-parents and spouses. And I went public. I gave interviews. I told my story. I told the world about Linda and Brian. I did it not to shame them, though the sow deserved every ounce, but because so many others needed to know they weren't alone. The day I walked into my father's office, now legally mine, I found a letter he had written but never mailed. It was addressed to me. Inside it read, Jessica, I don't know what they've told you. I don't know if I'm being fair anymore, but I love you and I'm proud of you. You've always been the best part of me. I sat there holding it, shaking for a long time. I knew then that I hadn't just reclaimed my inheritance. I had reclaimed my father's truth. And that was the real victory. It's been a year since the court's final ruling. I now live in a brownstone in Brooklyn, not out of luxury, but because it has a sunroom where I've built a small library filled with my father's old books. I keep the letter he wrote me in a frame by the window. On days when the world feels too heavy, I read it again, reminding myself why I fought so hard. Brian and Linda are no longer in the public eye. Their reputations were shredded. The museum permanently removed my father's name from any association with them, and instead installed a memorial wall honoring his philanthropic work, this time with my name right beneath his. But more importantly, True Kin has helped over 200 people so far. One woman, a teacher from Illinois, told me her father left her nothing because he didn't believe daughters should inherit. She fought, and she won. Another man from Florida had been manipulated by his stepmother into signing over his rights to his family business. We helped him get it back. Each case I read reminds me of that email my stepfather sent me, the one meant to break me. But now it fuels me. I don't see myself as a victim anymore. I see myself as a survivor, as an advocate, as someone who turned betrayal into purpose. Sometimes in moments of quiet, I still feel the ache of what I lost, the years, the family I thought I had, the version of my father who never got to say goodbye. But then I remember I gave him a voice. I gave myself a voice. And now, through this work, I'm giving that voice to others. Justice wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was becoming the woman they never saw coming, and the daughter my father always believed I could be.